Hi, McKinley.
Hi, Papa.
Are you close enough, or are you
Yep.
in the
Just
picture? Yeah,
works.
that's okay?
Yep.
Okay. So, we're gonna talk about my early days, huh?
Yep.
Okay. Well, you have any questions for me there?
Yeah, I have a couple. So, when did you learn to drive?
When did I learn to drive? Well, I grew up on a farm, and so I probably learned to drive things like tractors and so on when I was 13, 14 years old. And then we had vehicles on the ranch, like trucks and so on. And I think, I don't remember for sure, but you could get a driver's license at age 14, I think. But you could only go from your place to the local store or something. I think it was really just to use on the ranch, sort of, or if you had to go across the road to another ranch. I think it was when I was 14 or 15 at the most. A little different now, huh?
Yeah.
And we didn't have any seat belts, we didn't have anybody to ride along with us. There were no restrictions. So, when do you take, you've got a couple of years yet, huh?
No, I can get my learner's permit in February.
Whoa! Really?
Yeah.
Oh boy! Does your folks know about that?
Yeah.
Uh-oh. That's why they're so nervous, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, that's what happened. I've I've been in some accidents. Once when I was in high school, I was probably a junior maybe, and I played basketball in high school. And in the wintertime in December, my dad was taking a neighbor, a boy, and myself to Riverdale where we went to high school. We were getting on a bus to go to some tournament or something. And there was a new road that had been put in the year before near us, and we were taking that, and it dead end on another road. And in the fog, my dad was going fast because maybe he was late or something. But anyway, he didn't see that the cross street coming up, and so until we were right on it, and he hit the brakes, and the car rolled sideways into the bar pit, which is so fun. And then it hit that so hard that it flipped over a 4 barbed wire fence, or 4 barbed wires. So that's how much it flipped up, probably about 8 feet into the air. And in that twirling, it threw me out. My father had a ballpoint pens in his pocket here, and he hit the steering wheel. Nowadays they have collapsible steering wheels on our modern cars, but in those days it was just solid. So it broke all of his ribs where the pen was in his pocket. And my friend was thrown out. I was still in the car, I guess, when we landed on the wheels out in an alfalfa field. And I had an injured knee. It was the main thing I had, and so I had to go to the doctor twice a week, I think, to put heat on it. But fortunately, my knees never bothered me since then. I did wear a brace on it for the next 2 years when I played basketball and so on. But that was an accident I was in. I didn't cause it, though. When I was about 14, though, I was learning to drive, and we had a Model A Ford. The back had been cut off, so that it made it into like a little pickup. And so we used that around the ranch, and I was learning to drive it, and I don't know if I put it in forward instead of reverse. I don't remember the details, but I do know that it just crashed the whole fender and bumper, and the worst thing was it tore the corner of the it wasn't a garage, it was kind of a shed, but it tore that all off. Anyway. And then I was in another accident about probably more than 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And it was, we were remodeling a house on the 100 block of Coleridge. So I had to go down and talk to the contractor or whoever was doing it. So I got in my car here, backed out, and went, our house is only 100 feet from the intersection. And we have the right of way, there's no stop sign on Coleridge. And I started through the intersection. I could see off to the right this woman coming down Waverly in a big Chrysler LeBaron or something. And anyway, I thought, ugh, so I stepped on it and tried to get across before she would hit me. And she caught the rear of my car, flipped it over, and so once again I flipped over and it flipped it and turned it. And but it was once again on its wheels. I was facing back toward our house. So this accident occurred 100 feet from our house.
Oh, jeez.
That's why it's important to put your seatbelt on.
Yeah.
Because that's where most accidents occur, is near your own house. And anyway, I could see blood. Have you ever heard this story?
No, I haven't.
Anyway, you can see a little scar there, but I could feel blood coming out. I thought, oh, I hit my nose, my nose. So I'm holding my nose, and I asked the lady if she was okay. She was fine, and I could get out of the car, and I was fine. And anyway, so I'm holding my nose, and I'm thinking, and the mirror had been broken off the side, and I couldn't see where the blood was coming from, but I was holding my nose, and then it started coming down this way, so then I knew it was up here someplace. And so I came to the house. I thought, all I need is a mirror. So I came to the house, into the kitchen, and blood was streaming down, and then I could see it was up here. So I got a cloth, a washcloth or something, and held pressure on it. And while I'm doing that, I knew that it was pretty good gash here. I'd hit the rearview mirror. Even though I had a seatbelt on, I'd still hit it with my head. And somebody had pushed 911, and so the paramedics came, and they come right in my house because they followed the blood trails. So they came in, and I was calling the plastic surgeon, who was the head of plastic surgery at Stanford, was a friend of mine at the time. And so, because I knew I'd like to have him sew it up, because it was right in the middle of my face. Anyway, the police, or not the police, but the paramedics came in, and they tried to get me to go to the ambulance. And I said, no, I don't need an ambulance, And they just kept harassing me, asking me what my name was, my birthday, and so on, to see if I was cuckoo. Anyway, I'm standing there like this, and I said, if you want to do anything, you can give me a butterfly bandage to keep this together so it doesn't bleed anymore, because I had one hand up here and trying to call with the other hand. And anyway, they said, no, you've got to go to the ambulance. So they started to lead me away, and I said, no, and I'm kicking them away from I'm at this kitchen sink at this point, and I'm having to kick these guys away. I said, I'm not going I don't need to go to the hospital, I'm fine. Anyway, I finally got rid of the paramedics, and then I walk out walk them out to the front, and here are the policemen and more paramedics wandering all through our house, looking at things, I said, get the heck out of here, I mean, why don't you go out and look for speeders or something, what are you doing here? Anyway, it was, but it wasn't it wasn't serious to me, but it did do a lot of damage to the car. And actually I went skiing about 3 days later. I think that was on a Friday, I think, and we went skiing that weekend, so it wasn't that bad. Anyway, that's my driving experiences.
Alright. World War II was going on when you were in school. Were you affected by the war at all?
World War II, oh yes, that's a big war. Yeah, we were definitely affected. My father was on a farm that was owned by some people by the name of Schultz, and they lived in the city. And there was a draft, and all men got drafted, but you could get deferments or not have to go for certain reasons. And one is if you were a farmer, and actually, or if you had medical problems, they wanted healthy men. And my father, when he was 12 years old, was out with a friend or something, hunting rabbits or something, and he had a 22 over his back, and the bullet went off. He was going through a barbed wire fence with it on him, and it pulled the trigger, and so this bullet went into his, and rested against his spine. And so when you took a picture of an X-ray of him, there's this 22 bullet next to his spine. Anyway, I don't know what happened at the time, but it was probably nothing. I mean, he probably laid in bed for a day or something. But anyway, so they wouldn't take him because he had a bullet in him. And so he lived to be 83, and he had a bullet till he died in there. I mean, they took chest X-rays when he was older. It always showed up, that bullet. And but anyway, so my dad was deferred because he for a medical reason, because he had that bullet, although he was healthy, obviously. And Mr. Schultz had a son that was eligible for the draft, and so he didn't want him to go in the military, so he fired my dad, and so to put his son on the ranch. So Bill Schultz, who was his son, came on the ranch to farm it that we lived on where I was born. And then, so we had to move to another place. And so we lived in two different places during the Second World War, briefly for a year or two. My dad was manager of what was called the Burl Ranch, and actually the things I can remember there, because I was young, I was maybe, when the war broke out, I was only 4. I don't remember it breaking out and all that, but I do remember at the Burl Ranch, my parents were on I think it was a Civil Air Patrol, CAP, because the Japanese, had bombed Pearl Harbor, and then there were sightings of their submarines along the Pacific coast. So the fear was that they would bomb us from so we had to, like in the yard, I remember this, we used to have just light bulbs hanging out in the yard, and we had to put tin cans over them, big tin cans over them, so that the Japanese couldn't see this light bulb, so they wouldn't bomb us. And they did everything it was very, not very sophisticated by today's standards. And then my parents would take turns, and all the neighbors did. There was a 2-story tower, and they'd go there, sit and watch for airplanes coming, and they had to, if they saw one, they'd have to call them. And then, and I was during the school we had victory gardens. There was a lot of, because we wanted to win the war, so everybody, even kids in school, would grow vegetables and so on. So at school we had a victory garden. So, it affected me. I mean, not grossly because my parents weren't directly involved, and then there was rationing because we couldn't get rubber, which comes from Indonesia or someplace like that, and the Japanese had conquered these places. And so you could only buy, so many tires per year or whatever. So you had to have a ration stamp to buy tires for your car. For gasoline, you could only buy, so many gallons per week or month, whatever it was. And sugar was rationed, and butter was rationed. Those were the primary things they were rationed. But being on the farm, we hardly felt it because we made our own butter, and we got gasoline for the tractors and so on. So we couldn't take long trips, but we weren't really affected that much. But the people in the cities were very much affected. Someday I'll show you the ration stamps from your grandma. Grandma only, I think we still have hers from that war, because you get them for your kids, everybody. And I can remember when the war ended. Not so much when the war ended. I do remember because I got school out. And I remember when President Roosevelt, who was president and when he died, and that was a big thing because he'd been president for a long time. I forget, don't remember, 12 years or 16 years. And nowadays, presidents can only serve 2 terms.
Yes.
But anyway, so that's what I remember of the Second World War, and it was a tough time for a lot of people. But I remember more about the Korean War, which is occurred when I was more your age.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us about it?
Oh, I'm going to tell you about the Korean War.
Go into it.
Good. Well, the Korean War, Barbara and my sister is 7 years older, and Barbara and Bill had been married, and they had a child who was Janet, and she was just a baby, a real. Anyway, maybe before she was born, he had to go into the military. He was drafted out of Fresno State, where he was going to school with his Uncle Bill, and so he got stationed at Fort Ord, and he was Bill was a very good athlete. You know, all four sports, all 4 years in high school. He lettered in small high school, but he was still talented. He went to the state meet in track and things like that. So he was a talented athlete, and he was playing football for Fresno State. And so when he went in the military, there was all these military generals in different forts, you know, army bases, that would have a football team. And so Bill got, that was called special services. And so you get taken out of where you have to, you know, crawl in the dirt and shoot bullets and so on, you just played football. And you know, and one general against another general. This was the United States. You know? So Bill got on a football team and in special services. So he had a pretty easy time at Fort Ord. And we went over and watched him play football a couple of times. And I actually took a couple pictures of that. And I was probably, well, I was about your age, or maybe a year older. And anyway, as soon as the season was over, he had to go back to the regular unit, and he got sent to Korea. And so Barbara came to live with us. And so Barbara and Janet came and stayed with us for some time. Or maybe didn't live there all the time, but they were there most of the time. And so I remember Janet as a baby. I mean, she was like my baby sister when I was your age, see? And so that's why we're pretty close to Janet and Barbara. I had most of my family were in farming, so not many of them were drafted. I had one cousin, Dick, who just died last week, actually, that also went to the Korean War. He got a bronze medal, and he was a good friend of mine. He's the one I used to go camping with at Huntington Lake at Will-O-the-Wisp. And Bill and Dick Sheldon were stationed in Korea, I think 12 miles apart, and they never saw each other. They would exchange letters, but you couldn't go from one place. They were on the front lines. They were actually on the front lines. And Bill was actually, I think he was a driver for a general or something, a colonel, and so he didn't really get in a lot of close battles, I think. Anyway, the saddest part of my life was when they came home. I'll break into tears. Pull yourself together, Dwayne. Anyway, this, it was a year or so later, the war, I don't know if it was over or they just rotated. They came in a ship under the Golden Gate Bridge, and we met them in San Francisco. And it was foggy, really foggy. And the ship comes in, they start playing the Stars Spangled Banner. And it was just very emotional. And I still remember it. That's the most saddest thing I've experienced. But that was a war, you know. So I was affected, but in the Korean War more than World War II. Okay, let's get off the wars.
All right. Let's see.
Uh,
I have a good one here. What was your first job?
My first job was picking tomatoes off of tomato worms off of tomatoes, and I got paid a penny a piece for that. And then I used to have we had a lot of gophers on the ranch, and they'd make holes in the ditch, and we'd lose all the water, so we had to kill the gophers. So I'd have gopher traps, and I had a whole bunch of them, and so I'd set them in the morning and then come back at night, and vice versa. So I had these traps going. I got 10 cents a gopher, and so that was my first jobs I really got paid for. And then when I was about 12 or 13, maybe a little bit younger than you, a neighbor had apricots, and he had in the springtime, this time of year in June, they get ripe, and so they hired a high school, a junior, senior in high school, a big guy, and he would shake the tree, and then my cousin and I, who was the same age as I was, Donnell, we would pick them up and put them in buckets. And so we did this, it seemed like it was 10 days, and we'd get up early in the morning and do it all day long and go home at night. We were really tired, I remember. So we worked pretty hard. And then we'd go swimming in the canal after that. But after it was all over, 10 days later, they were cutting these apricots and drying them, so they'd take them to the shed, and they would cut them and take the pits out and put them up this way and put them on trays, put them in the sulfur shed. And so there were ladies doing the cutting and so on in the shed. And then they ended up with dried apricots. And anyway, at the end of that time, we went to get our pay from this farmer, and he, I don't know, something like $25 that we had earned, because we got 20 cents a bucket or whatever it was. Anyway, he deducted, when he gave us a check, he deducted, I think it was $3 or $4 from our check. He only gave us $20 instead of 25, and that was for all the apricots that we threw. Now, can you believe that a 13-year-old boy would throw apricots at another 13-year-old boy? So that was my first job. That was a real job, because I was working for somebody besides my father. Anyway, I had a lot of other jobs. When I went to Stanford, I looked in the Palo Alto Times, and there was an ad for somebody to do yard work. So I went, and I would come into town and some dig and so on, and these people would pay me pretty well. I mean, the going rate was like $2 an hour, but I'd get a lot more for that sometimes as a student. And then I started, then I got a hashing job. Do you know what that is? Well, I used to hire students to work in the cafeterias and so on, and you serve the food and pick up the trays. And it's like in a restaurant, you have people that do that. And that was called hashing. And so most people, or a lot of people my age did that. And we had, so I hashed there, and then I was accepted to USC, to dental school, and I lived in a rooming house where there were 6 or 7 other students. And one of the guys there was the head of a dormitory, the staff that did the hashing. And so when I was a freshman, I started hashing again in dental school, and we would get our meals and $3 an hour, I think it was, or something like that. And I learned a lot from this head hasher, because he was German, very Germanic, and everything was and these girls were freshman girls in college. And they had come from wealthy homes in Southern California, most of them, and had been just waited on hand and foot, Well, he says, we're going to have to train them. So if they wanted coffee, they had to turn their cup over and put the handle to the right. If they wanted tea, they had to put it to the left, the handle on the cup. And if they didn't turn it over, we wouldn't give them anything, because we'd go around with coffee and tea. And, I mean, he had those girls trained, you know, at first they were, but these were freshmen in high school, and he trained them. Anyway, I learned a lot from him in this hashing job. The other thing I learned from him was, there was a big banquet hall where they would have 500 people at a banquet, and so we'd be hashers at that too, and we'd carry the trays in and out. And they had ladies that would serve them, but we would carry mostly big trays because we were strong. And when there'd be 500 people, and it was in the wintertime, they'd all have coats on, so we'd set up a coat check. And so we'd take turns working there, and so I was very reluctant to take, you know, coins from these people, but, and Carl Reeder was his name, he came by and he said, oh no, he says, you don't leave quarters in there. So he says, what you do is if somebody puts quarters in there, you take those out, you put a couple dollar bills in there, so it makes people think that everybody's giving dollar bills, so they'll give a dollar bill, you know, when you give them their coat. Anyway, I learned that you have to expect more in life. I mean, if you want to get ahead. I learned a lot of things from Carl like that, and then he taught me efficiency too. We had to set up this banquet hall, and we'd do that at night when there was nobody around, and we were getting paid like, I think it was like $3 an hour. But so we had to do our own time cards. We just had to write how much time we wrote or spent. He said, if, you know, this job is going to take 3 hours to set up the tables, because we had to put a platform and then the speaker's table on that, and then a podium for the speaker, and then we'd have to, sometimes the tables would go this way, sometimes this way. They wanted for 6 people or 8 or 10 or whatever. So say if it took 3 hours, he'd say, you know, if you can do that in 2 hours, we'll put down that you worked 3 hours, because that's if you just sort of did it very slow. So anyway, we used to get paid, instead of $3, we could almost got so that we could almost double it. So by working very efficiently, you know, we would push a whole lot of chairs to one end, and anyway, I learned efficiency from Carl Reeder. Okay, I think that's enough about my jobs.
Let's see. Where did you practice as a dentist?
Well, when I got out of dental school, I was single and the youngest dentist in the country that year, and I had gone through these periods where there was a draft. In the Second World War, there was a draft. Korean War, there was a draft, and so I knew that, and dentists and physicians got put into a different category because they had only taken as many of them as they needed, and so I was afraid that I would get drafted again, or get drafted, because they took single people and young people first, and so I joined the Air Force. I wasn't drafted. I actually joined sort of as an insurance policy. I thought that'd be, you know, to get, because you could join and serve 2 years, and then you didn't have to serve again. And as it turned out, it was very good that I did that, because the second year I was in the Air Force, there was what was called the Berlin Crisis. You'll have to read about it sometime. And it was where, after the Second World War, Russia, the U.S., France, and Great Britain split up Germany so that they couldn't, because there was World War I and World War II were caused by the Germans. And so they didn't want that to happen again. And then Berlin, which is the capital in the middle of the country, they divided that in 4 sections. Well, the Russians section, they wanted to do things different than France, England, and the US. And so there was a highway, a freeway, Autobahn they were called in Germany, that went into Berlin to supply it with food and fuel and so on. Anyway, the Russians were trying to starve off, because they owned the property around it, controlled the property around Berlin. So they cut the supply into Berlin, and so we started flying stuff into Berlin, and so that went on for a year maybe or something. So Berlin was only kept alive because of mostly the U.S., but the French and English flew goods into them, and so they extended everybody's that was in the military. They extended their duty if they're about to get out, and the amount of time they had to spend in, and then they started drafting some people, and they needed more dentists and physicians, so they started drafting. So a lot of guys that I went to dental school with got drafted a year after they got out of school. They rented an office, they bought equipment, they bought a house, they bought a Porsche, and they were in debt up to here, and then they got kind of pulled in to serve in the military, for $700 a month, and they lost everything. So it was a good thing that I did. So I went in Birmingham, Alabama, where they had orientation for the Air Force medical officers. And so I was there for about a month in September. It's hot. I'd never been in hot, humid weather like that. It was fairly easy, and we were confined to within 100 miles of the base on weekends, I think. But there was one guy in there from New Orleans, and that was about, I think, 300 or 400 miles away, or it was 200 or 300 miles away. And so he says, let's go to New Orleans for the weekend. So one time we drove down to New Orleans and spent the weekend on Bourbon Street, New Orleans, and came back. Anyway, so then I went from Birmingham, Alabama to Alaska. I'd been assigned to Alaska ahead of time. And so I spent most of my time in the military in Alaska practicing dentistry. And when I was in Seattle, getting ready to, I got on a plane in Seattle, and it was prop plane, or turboprop plane in those days. So it took from Seattle to Anchorage, took I think 6 hours. Nowadays you could do it in half that time, but on that flight, the guy sitting right next to me, like you know, in the seat, was my commanding officer. He was going to be he was the new dental commanding officer. He was a colonel, and so we sat, together for 6 hours and talked the whole time. And so when he arrived at the base, and he took over the command of all the dentists, there were 30 dentists on this base. So the first day I went to work, he called me. I did amalgam fillings, silver fillings, which is the easiest thing to do. And that's what most people that go in the military end up just doing that. He called me in, and he said, Dwayne, he says, I want you to take over the surgery department, emergency. Oh, whoa. I said, okay. And so they would have what was called sick call, and anybody that had a toothache or sore in their mouth or anything would come to the dental clinic and in the morning. And so there were chairs up and down the hallway, and we'd have maybe 30 or 40 guys sitting there. And so my job was to get these guys in. I had 2 chairs, everybody else only had 1. Get these guys in, and we would look in their mouths and see what the problem was. And either if they had an impacted wisdom tooth, there was an oral surgeon at the hospital, so we'd send them there, or if they had just a chipped tooth, we'd smooth it over, or whatever had to be done. And then in the afternoon, I was to do minor surgery, which was extracting teeth and doing root canals. And I had not done a lot of root canals in school. So I started doing root canals, and I remember airman that assisted me, the first day I went into surgery, the first day I was there was some surgery cases scheduled, and we had to lay a flap of the tissue, and I'd never done that before, and so I stayed up all of the night before reading a book on oral surgery. And so I went in there and I'm thinking, how do I do this? I'm standing there like that, and all of a sudden there's this instrument in my hand, and he had worked for board certified oral surgeons for a couple of years in hospitals, so he knew what I was supposed to do. So I mean, it was really on the job training. And so I would cut, and then I would think, what do I do next? There would be an instrument in my hand, and I'd use an elevator, which in dental school we weren't able to use. And anyway, so I learned a lot in a short period of time. You learn a lot from other people, and you know, if you ever get a chance, soak up what you learn from other people. And so I ended up doing that for more than a year, and I got very good at diagnosing things that were wrong and doing root canals and doing surgery, because we do some real, and we get more brave all the time and do that. Anyway, we spent 2 years, so 2 years in Alaska. The second year, Omi and I were married, and so she lived there 1 year. Then we left there, and we drove the Alcan Highway. I had this blue Ford and coupe, sort of, and we drove the Alcan Highway. Took us, I forget how many days, but maybe a week. And we had all of our possessions in the back seat of this car, in the trunk. And I think we had camping gear, because we used to camp a lot in Alaska. So we'd camp at night. And on that trip, there was a instance where we had a cat, because I only didn't like staying alone, and I got sent out to these remote air bases sometimes. So I got her a kitten, so it grew into a cat, and it got pregnant, and the week before we were to leave, it had a miscarriage. Well, so the cat was just kind of laying around, but it was time for us to leave, so we put the cat in the back, and it just went to sleep in the back of the car. We drove down the Alcan, and about the third night, we were in the Yukon Territory, in northern Canada, and it had been raining, and there was no gas stations for like 50 miles at a time, so you had a booklet that told you how far it was to the next gas station. And so we're halfway in between. We're 25 miles from one and 25 from the next one, and we have a flat tire. And we were driving a long ways that day, so it was we'd probably gone 700 miles on a dirt road, which is a long ways, maybe 600. Anyway, so I pulled off to the side, got the jack out, and it has a square flat foundation, and put the jack in there, and I jacked it up, and was just about to get the tire off when all of a sudden this jack, it had been raining, and it was on dirt on the shoulder of the road, and the base of that jack went like this. The car fell off of the jack, and then I heard with a square base, which was metal, and it went like this. And the gas tank in those days were in the trunk, under the trunk, and it cut a gash about yay big in the gas tank. All of our gas ran out. So, fortunately, we had the jerry cans, which was a 5-gallon jerry cans are from the Second World War. It's a leftover term. It's a 5-gallon flat on each side canister for holding gas. So we had a couple of those with us. So what I did was I jacked the car back up, made it more stable when I got it jacked up, and then saw the gash. I thought, how am I going to seal that? Because we can't drive with it like that, with all the gas gone. So I got a piece of wood, found a piece of wood, took the axe, chiseled it down to about that same size, and then I thought, it's not perfect the same as I, so I need something to shim it with, and or a gasket like thing. So I took a leather glove and put around it, and then pounded that wood up into the gas tank. Anyway, so we took off and drove, and we got to a place where there was a gas station, because I'd put a gallon or two in at a time, so it would, in case it was leaking, I didn't want to lose it all. But we made it to the next gas station that night. We threw out our tent, and because it was misty rain, and a cat would always sleep in our sleeping bags with us. Well, in the middle of the night, we heard this, like this, and a lot of commotion, and the tent was going like this, and we'd seen bears that day, and I thought, oh no, that cat's got tangled up with a bear. And then, so we pulled the sleeping bag over our head to start with until everything calmed down, and then I got a flashlight and looked out, and here was our cat standing there like this. All of its hair, how cats, their hair stands on end when they're scared. And he was just really standing like that. And there was a lynx. What had happened, I could see with the flashlight, there was a lynx standing out there, northern lynx, which is a big cat. And he had tangled with that cat. Anyway, so getting the gas thing fixed, we went to the gas station, and we had a flat tire. We had no spare at this point. So I says, can anybody fix this tire? And the lady says, well, my husband is the one that does that, and he's off on a drunk. And I said, on a drunk? How long does that, will he be back in the morning? She says, no, he's usually gone for 2 or 3 days when he's off on a drunk. And so, this is way out in the boonies, so this guy went into town, I guess, and would get drunk anyway. I says, is there anybody that knows how to change a tubeless tire? Because I changed tires and put tubes in them, but I didn't know how to do a tubeless tire. She says, well, my 8-year-old son has watched his dad a lot. He's out in the garage all the time. So anyway, this 8-year-old boy and I changed the tire. So I learned how to change a tubeless tire from an 8-year-old boy that had watched his father. And so we got a spare, and the gas seemed to be staying in the car. So I filled it up and filled the jerry cans up because it was 120 miles to the next town. I didn't even mention anything about the hole in the gas tank because I thought if nobody could change a tire, I'm not going to let them do it. Anyway, so we got to this next town, to Whitehorse, I think it was, and we went to the first station and their shop and garage, and I said, does anybody know how to fix a gas? I told them the problem. This guy said, oh yeah, I can weld, I can do that. And I thought, weld a tank full of gas, or with gas fumes, even the fumes of gases will explode. And oh, geez. He says, yeah, he says, just leave it here for an hour or so. He said, why don't you go have lunch and come back? Which we did, and so he welded that close. I guess he blew it out. He must have blown it out with air, compressed air, got all the fumes out. But he welded that close somehow or other. So we drove all the way to California with that. And I think he only charged me like $30 to do that. And I drove the car for another year or two, and we never replaced that tank, because I was imagining we're in Whitehorse, that's a 3-day drive here, we're going to have to call Seattle and they'll send up a gas tank, and then put it in. I thought we were stuck there for a week, but we were there for an hour and took off. Then when we got to the border, the Canadian-US border, and you can't take animals across international borders because of the vaccines that they have had. You can if you have proof of vaccinations. And so the customs and immigration people were asking us these questions, and he says, do you have any animals? And I said no, because the cat would always sleep, and he tangled with this lynx a couple of days before. He would always sleep down below in the car, and we wouldn't see him all day long. Well, just as I said no, I happened to see in the rearview mirror, and here behind me was our cat. He was standing up stretching, you know, he'd been sleeping, but he was so hot, we had so much stuff in the back of our car that he was up against the headliner. And so the officer that was standing there couldn't see him, you know, so anyway, we drove off. So we got our cat, because he had been vaccinated, but a good friend of mine was a veterinarian on the base where we lived, and he didn't give me any certificate for it. So anyway, that cat was named Iggy Oggy, and so we left it with Aunt Carol and her parents in Los Angeles, as we left and went to Europe for 3 months after that. But, anyway, we've gotten way off the subject here. What'd you ask me?
Here's
It's a second word. Oh, the dentist, yes. Anyway, so Omi and I went to Europe for 3 months. We bought a Volkswagen Beetle because Omi had worked as a dental hygienist in Anchorage, and she was, I think, the 22nd dental hygienist to be registered, and she has a certificate, 22nd one in Alaska. So she worked when I was doing dental work on the base, and we saved all of her income because we could live on mine. We could pay our rent, our cars, and food, and so on. So we saved hers for a year, and so we had $2,000 or $3,000 or something like that left, maybe $5,000 we had in the bank after being married for a year. So you could buy a Volkswagen Beetle, you know what those are? You could $1,200, and you could get them cheaper in Europe than you could here. So because they were only made in Europe in those days, and so we flew Icelandic Airways, which is the cheapest flight out of New York. We went from New York to Newfoundland to Iceland to Glasgow, Scotland, and I forget where we ended up, but maybe it was I think four stops to get to Europe. And you know, it was, I forget how many hours, 12-hour flight or something. And then we went to the factory at Wolfsburg, Germany, and that's where they make the Volkswagens. And we picked up a brand new Volkswagen for $1,200. So we drove around Europe for 3 months like that. And actually, my mother and a cousin of hers came to Europe for a week, and they actually rode with us in this Volkswagen. You know, I put a rack in every day. I'd have to put the suitcases on the top and so on. And anyway, so then we came back, and we shipped it back to New York from Belgium. Then we went to England and spent a week there, and they said it would take 10 days to get it by ship from Belgium to New York. So we spent a week in England and so on, and then we flew from there to New York. And your Omi had a cousin that was ambassador of the UN from South Africa. He lived on Park Avenue in New York. He had servants and so on. We stayed with them. But he was a very uptight kind of guy. And by this time, Omi was pregnant with Joy. And she was about 6 months pregnant, I think. So she was starting to show. And here I can see, in hindsight, I can see why he was so nervous about us being there. I had no job, no money, a pregnant wife, and we were camped in his apartment. Anyway, so we left there and went down to Washington, D.C. and spent the next week with my cousin that lived in Washington, D.C. because this guy was so nervous about us being there. And so Omi went to her obstetrician, and the obstetrician told Omi that she was going to have twins because she had gained 40 pounds or 45 pounds in 6 months, which is a lot more than you should. Anyway, the obstetrician thought they could hear too hard. So Joy was not, she was a big baby, but she wasn't a twin. But we thought for a couple of months that we were going to have twins. And then, so we left. Our car finally came in. It took, instead of 10 days, it took like 16 or 17. And so it came in, and this was late November, I think, and maybe the 1st of December. And we drove across the country, so it was sort of middle America we came across. and, because it wasn't too stormy yet, it wasn't too cold yet. And so we got to California, and I started looking for a job, and there were different jobs, and I liked, and when I was in the service, I was in a group practice. There were 30 of us, in one big clinic essentially, and there were all kinds of specialties in this one clinic, kind of like the Palo Alto Medical Clinic. Anyway, so I kind of liked that idea, and there was a group in Palo Alto there were 10 dentists, and they were looking for an associate, so we settled here, and that's the we stayed when I was looking for jobs in the what's the motel chain that has a Sleepy Little Bear. Anyway, it's still almost at the end of Matadero. It's in Palo Alto, and it's still the same motel.
Wow.
And that was in 1962, so that was 51 years ago. Then we got an apartment on Kirtner Avenue, which is, I didn't really know where Kirtner is. It's across El Camino from where you live. There are a lot of apartments on that street. And we lived there for a year and a half. Joy was born. And we lived in a one-bedroom apartment, unfurnished. And so we bought a mattress. We slept on the floor, but we didn't have any bedstead or anything. Then we saved enough money that we had, I think it was $6,000 or $8,000, this was a couple of years later. Omi was working some too. And so we saved enough to buy a house. And so, anyway, I went to work with the Palo Alto Dental Group. And since I could do root canals and nobody else could, I started doing root canals. And there were 10 guys there, and I would do all their root canals. And then other dentists in Palo Alto heard that I could do root canals. There was no endodontist in Palo Alto. And so they started sending patients to me, even though I was in a group. And I would just do the root canals and send it to them. And I was also I got fascinated with doing anterior aesthetic work, and so I did some of that. And Polaroid, I don't know if you know, there used to be about that time, about in the early 60s, Polaroid developed a camera that you could take a picture and then pull the film out, and the picture would develop right there. And so you could have an instant photograph, say. And then they developed one where you could take it in the mouth, you spread the teeth, the cheeks of and then take a picture. So you could take a picture of a patient's mouth and then send that to the laboratory, and they could make the teeth look the same color and shape and so on. Anyway, I started doing that. So my practice was never really a big general practice, but it was always sort of, I did a lot of root canals. I never did children's dentistry, and I didn't make any dentures, and I never did any of that stuff. So, and then, a few years later, 3 or 4 years later, I was so busy that I limited my practice to just doing root canals. So, anyway, we've lived here ever since, 1962.
Let's see. What did you do for free time in college?
For free time in college, well, when I was a freshman in college, I didn't have to, but I joined the ROTC. Actually, I was in the Air Force ROTC, and you did that to get a deferment because the Korean War was still on, I think, anyway, there was still a draft, and if you weren't in the top 2/3 of your class, or half, something, you would get drafted. I mean, you'd have to go in the military. So when I started Stanford, I wasn't too sure that I could be in the top half or 2/3 of my class, and so I joined the ROTC, and the ROTC was a Reserve Officer Training Corps, is what it stood for. And all colleges had an Air Force, Navy, and Army. And when you graduated, you become an officer then. in that. So they taught us how to march. We wore uniform. Once a week I had to go do that. And then I took classes, special classes, so, on, about the parts of airplanes and how airplanes fly and stuff like that. Anyway, so I did that, and we played intramural football. I didn't play any sports in college, but we did. And then I had a pretty heavy schedule, so I didn't have a lot of extra time. I did a lot of studying. And then I joined a fraternity. So the second year I was at school at Stanford, I lived in the fraternity house. And we used to play volleyball outside, and I'd go to football games. And so I had, in fact, my sophomore year in college, I had a roommate who had just come from Australia. And I don't know if you've met any Australians, but they have, every country that speaks the same language will have different expressions and so on. So we were going to the football stadium, and they had, in those days, they had card tricks where you would get a stack of cards like this, and be red, orange, white, and so on, and a number, and then they would be down at the bottom of the stadium would be somebody that would hold up a number, say number 6, and on number 6 I would hold up a red card. Well, it would spell Stanford, those were card tricks, very popular in those days. But you had to wear a white shirt, so that the background was all white, and then these cards would be in colors, see, so it was more effective that way. So in order to sit in the cheering section, you had to have a white shirt on. Well, Frank, this Australian friend, or roommate, for the first game, first part of September, comes out of the house, and we're walking over to the stadium, and he's got a plaid shirt on. I said, Frank, don't you want to sit in the rooting section? He says, the rooting section? Yeah! I said, well, you have to have a white shirt on. He said, really? So he runs back in, gets a white shirt, comes running, catches up with us. Well, it comes to find out that he had seen movies of American football games where there were 100,000 people in the stadium. And the word rooting in Australia means sexual intercourse. So he was imagining a little section up in the corner where you... Anyway, we got more laughs over that. So I learned Australian from him. And so you have to be careful what words you use, and even countries that speak your own language, Anyway, but we had, we played intramural sports, so that's what I did. So.
So what was life like in Alaska?
In Alaska, well, it was different because I had grown up in California, and I arrived there in October, and well, I think in both years I was there, by Halloween, which is the end of October, there was snow on the ground in Anchorage. We'd have a snow, so and then it would stay there until April. So it had snow on the ground for a long period of time. The sun, you're far north, and the sun, by December, which is the shortest days of the year, it would just come up like it is here, like an hour before sunup, an hour after sunup. And then it would skim across this horizon, and then at 2:30 in the afternoon it would go down. So it was daylight, but it wasn't like 12 o'clock in the daytime here, So it's kind of depressing, if you thought about it. But I'd go to work in the dark and come home in the dark, even, in the wintertime. The summertime was just the opposite. And so, it's adjustment. It's a fun thing about living in northern climates like that. People would put aluminum foil on their bedroom windows to block out the light so that their kids would sleep and so on. I learned to ski in Alaska. I went hunting. I got there's a goat that's upstairs that I killed when I was there. We had gone after Doll sheep, which is a curly haired. So you know, we had a lot of experiences. And skiing was, we had a base right, or a ski lift right on the base, which was not much of a hill, just a beginner's hill. And it had a rope tow, and it had lights, so we'd go out there at night. And that's how I learned to ski, was on a rope tow, right on the base, actually. And then up higher elevation, they had another ski resort, which had chairlifts as well. And so we would go up there at night. So you know, after work or dinner, you'd go up and you'd go skiing. So most of the skiing I did was at night when I learned to ski. In the wintertime, the military did that for recreation, you know, so that the guys would have some place for recreation. And in fact, when I was there, they tried to get artificial snow. Was just somebody had discovered how to do that, and so they tried to get, and because we didn't get a lot of snow in Anchorage. Anchorage is on the backside of the mountains from where the storms are, so it doesn't get a lot of snow. But so one year we didn't have much snow, and they tried to get it through Congress to get the money to put in a snowmaking machine on our slope. Well, Congress says, no way are we going to do that. Snowmaking in Alaska, we'd be voted out of office, you know. So they had a hard time getting, I mean, nowadays everybody has snowmaking machines, you know, but in those days that was a new thing. But I had a friend from there that was a ski instructor, so I just go with him all the time and ski, which was fun. And we went fishing. We did a lot of fishing because there's, you know, I tried to take advantage of the things that were there that I wouldn't be doing here. We had a golf course, but there's signs on it, you know, careful for moose crossing. And, you know, the one or two times